In the far southeast of North Carolina, the land is at odds with itself. The pine forest comes down out of the hills ordered and dry, and then somewhere the more south you go, it loosens, softens and gives way to blackwater swamp, tannin dark and slow moving. The kind of water that holds the sky on its surface and shows you nothing underneath. This is Bladen County, cotton and tobacco country, with mill towns strung along the rail line. And in the winter of 1953, in the town of Bladenboro, there were fewer than 800 people living there. It was the sort of place where you knew your neighbours, where you knew the sound of your own dogs, especially in the dark. The difference between a dog barking at a passing car and a dog barking at something else. And that distinction is definitely going to matter later on. Because over the course of a few short weeks that winter, the people of Bladenboro would come to believe that something had come out of the swamp. Something that killed their animals in the night. That no single witness could seemingly describe quite the same way twice. And it was a creature that no hunt could seemingly bring down. And like all such creatures, they gave it a name, the Beast of Bladenboro. And by the time it was over, the town would have something else too. Something it turned out to be rather good at holding on to. A story. To understand what happened here, you have to hold two different landscapes in your head at once. The first is the one you'd expect, the predator landscape. Rural Bladen County in the 1950s was not short of animals that could kill a dog. Bobcats lived in these woods and everyone knew it. And that's the important part. A bobcat was not exotic here. It was ordinary. The people of Bladenboro had grown up alongside them. Many had hunted them. They knew their size, they knew their tracks, they knew what one could and couldn't do. A bobcat was, if anything, a bit boring. The mountain lion, though, was a different matter. By the 1950s, the cougar had been effectively wiped out of North Carolina. It was logged and hunted out around the turn of the century. With no confirmed breeding population in the state for the better part of 50 years, if not more. So a cougar here would have been genuinely out of place. Not impossible though. We know that mountain lions from the Midwest can and do disperse eastwards and might on occasion get that far. One from the Black Hills in Dakota made it to Connecticut in 2011 before being hit and killed on a highway. And a wandering Florida panther is also not out of the question for the period. But it's not an animal that a local would casually assume in either case. And we do need to factor in feral dogs. It's less romantic and it's less frightening on paper, but it's very real. And it's a persistent presence around the swamps and farms. And, as we'll see, capable of far more than people tend to give them credit for. So that's the first landscape. Hold on to it. The second landscape is the one that usually gets left out of the telling. And for me, it's the one I actually find the most interesting. Because Bladenboro, for a town of under 800, had a remarkable concentration of people who understood the value of a good story. The newspapers of both nearby Charlotte and Wilmington were within easy reach, and they were hungry for copy. And this was a slow news season by any means. The mayor of Bladenboro was a man named Woodrow Fussell. He was known locally as Bob. And, as I say, Fussell was the mayor. But he was also the owner of the town's movie theatre. And those are both facts that you'll need to keep in the same hand. This was a man whose civic job was to reassure a frightened town, but also who had a day job selling tickets to be thrilled. We'll come back to him. And underneath both those landscapes, there is a third thing. It's older, quieter. The American South has a long tradition of the phantom cat. There's the catamount, the mountain screamer, whose cry in the night sounds like a woman in distress. In parts of the region, there are older stories still. These include the wampus cat, a creature half feline and half something else. And these stories are tied to punishment and omen and death. These are not idle details. They are potentially a template, a shape that fear already knows how to reach for in this community. And it's sitting ready in the culture, just waiting for an occasion. And in the last days of December 1953, it got one. It begins, as these things often do, with a dog that wouldn't stop barking. On the 29th of December, in Clarkton, a small community about 8 miles from Bladenboro, a woman heard her neighbour's dogs in an absolute state. She went out to see what was troubling them. And what she saw was an animal she didn't recognise. She described it as large, sleek, black, and around 5 feet long. And it moved off almost as soon as she appeared. That was the whole of the incident. A sighting, albeit an uneasy one. On its own, nothing. But then things escalate. 2 days later, on the 31st, on the outskirts of Bladenboro, a man named Johnny Vause found what was left of his 2 dogs. And the scene told a story of a real fight. You know, it was clear that there'd been a lengthy battle. There was a great deal of blood in the kennels. On the porch, there was also a pool of saliva and more blood beside it. One dog had been badly savaged. The second had been partially decapitated with its jaw torn away. Now, whatever else you conclude from this episode, sit with that detail for a moment. Tearing the jaw from a dog, particularly a hound dog, is not a casual act. This is not the work of something small. This was without doubt a powerful animal. And it had done something that required real force. The Vause killings were reported in the Charlotte News on the 7th of January. By then, they were no longer isolated incidents, because on the next day, the 1st of January, 2 more dogs were killed. And it's here, in the reporting of these deaths, that a particular phrase enters the story for the first time. The animals, it was said, had been drained of blood. Now, hold that phrase too, because we're going to need it later when we look at all of this. But I'll note one thing now, because it complicates the neat version, and it's something that we should discuss. One of these dogs actually appears to have been fed on, which is worth flagging because it doesn't quite fit the picture that was forming in some ideas. Then there's the 2nd of January, when another dog was taken. The 3rd, 2 more, and again that signature of overwhelming force with another smashed jawbone. 2 of the dogs, it was said, were also missing their tongues. On the night of the 3rd, the chief of the police, Roy Vause, took his own hounds out to track whatever was doing this. His dogs refused to take the trail. I've always thought that's one of the most quietly unsettling details in the whole case. It really adds that sort of supernatural spook to it. And I'll leave it where it is for now. The Wilmington Morning Star picked up the story on the 4th of January. And on that same day, a man named Lloyd Clemens got a proper look at the animal. His dogs had gone, mad at something. They were constantly agitated, that signal we saw before. And his description is worth quoting closely because it does something interesting in the telling. He describes it as about 20 inches at the shoulder, with a 14-inch tail, which he nonetheless described as long, despite that being just over a foot. He described the animal as dark in colour, and of the face he said it had a face exactly like a cat. Only he added he'd never seen a cat that big. But here's the thing about Clemens's description. These dimensions are not actually huge. They're not wildly outside what a large bobcat could be. 20 inches at the shoulder is big for a bobcat, but not impossible, and it's quite small for pretty much everything else. What's telling is that Clemens, a local man who knew perfectly well what a bobcat was, came away with the distinct sense that this was something bigger, something out of place, something wrong. And the sightings kept coming. A young boy, Dalton Norton, reported a big cat on his porch, making a sound like a baby crying. That's a detail that fits a mountain lion or a bobcat equally. And of course, it fits the catamount legend better than either. That one also reached the Charlotte News on the 7th of January, and on the night of the 5th, it got personal. And Mrs. C.E. Kinlaw went out to defend her dogs and found herself rushed by the animal when she tried to intervene. By her account, it was her own screaming that seemed to confuse the animal and put it off. It made it think better of the whole situation. It broke off its attack and disappeared off into the night. But of course, by now, the town was past unease. It was beginning to be afraid. And the response was a hunt, then more hunts. The reports vary, but somewhere between 800 and 1,000 people took to the woods and swamps around Bladenboro with rifles, shotguns, you name it. Sit with that number against the other one. As I mentioned before, the town's population was 796. So there were, quite literally, more armed men in those woods than there were residents of the town they'd come to protect. I also want to flag one more event before we get to how this ends, because of where it falls in the timeline. On the 9th of January, right at the peak of the fear, with the woods full of guns, Mayor Fussel's movie theatre screened a film. And that film was called The Big Cat, a film that came out in 1949. And it's a picture about a mountain lion terrorising a rural community. Just think about what it would take, how long to book that film, build up some PR for it in that sort of time period. I'm just going to leave it there on the 9th where it happened. Because 2 days later, on the 11th, something shifts. The sightings have begun to simmer down, and the mood in the town has curdled, not away from the beast, but towards the hunters. 800 to 1,000 strangers with rifles wandering the swamp at night is its own kind of danger. People were now afraid to go outside, especially at night, but not because of the animal, because of the men hunting it. And on the 13th of January, the problem seemingly solves itself. A local man, Luther Davis, killed a bobcat and brings it to town for display. And the town's officials, Fussell foremost among them, wasted no time. The carcass was displayed, photographed, and publicly declared to be the Beast of Bladenboro. The threat, the town was told, had been eliminated. But, of course, there are a couple of loose threads around that same date worth mentioning. First, a man named Bruce Soules reported hitting a large cat with his car on the 13th of January. It was an animal he put at about 24 inches at the shoulder and notably said it was spotted like a leopard. It was said to have been taken to nearby Tabor City. And it's worth knowing that ocelots, Small spotted cats were kept as pets in the region in the 1930s and 40s, so a feral population isn't out of the question. So a spotted cat on a country road isn't quite as strange as it sounds. Though it has to be said, an ocelot is far too small to be our killer, especially of dogs. There are also further animal deaths after the 14th though. A few more attacks. In this case, pigs and chickens killed on a tenant farm near Robeson Memorial Hospital. And again, the pigs had their skulls crushed. Officials blamed a stray 65-pound dog. But the farmer, a man named McLam, didn't buy it. He pointed out his chickens were roosting in the trees. And there was another reported hog attack on the 20th. But officially, it was over. The bobcat had been produced and the story had an ending, at least officially. The only trouble is that the bobcat still doesn't survive scrutiny against the evidence. Let's take the official answer first because I think it collapses quickly. A bobcat did not do most of what we've described here. Let's start with the simplest problem. Everyone in Bladenboro knew what a bobcat was. These were people who lived alongside bobcats and hunted them. The whole reason the town was frightened is that what they were seeing and finding did not match the animal they knew. Then there's the physical reality. A bobcat weighs generously around 30 pounds. It's not built to crush the skull of a hound dog or tear the jaw from one. And bobcats as a rule do not take on adult dogs at all. That's why they use dogs to hunt them. Let alone will they take on several of them across 2 weeks for almost no reason. The eyewitness accounts from the Clemens, Kinlaw, they report the sheer size and force reported again and again, but do not describe a bobcat. And the timing of Davis's bobcat, I think, gives the game away. It doesn't answer a single sighting, but it did resolve the town's mood. It arrived exactly when the real danger had become the 800 armed strangers in the swamp. And it arrived courtesy of the one man in town whose job was to make the fear stop. The bobcat wasn't a solution to the killings, but it was a solution to the panic and the fear that had been generated by them. But I think we need to accept that those are two different problems, and that Carcass only ever addressed the second one. So, set the bobcat aside. What actually happened here? I want to deal first with that phrase, drained of blood, because it's the single most important thing to get right and question. And getting it right tells you almost everything about this legend was built. There is a piece of sort of basic physiology that the people of Bladenboro in 1954 had no particular reason to know. And that's that when an animal dies, its blood, of course, stops circulating and it begins to settle under gravity into the lowest parts of the body. It's called livor mortis. The blood doesn't vanish, but it could look that way. It just pulls downward out of sight. So a carcass found lying in a field, examined from above, can genuinely look bloodless, while all of its blood is simply resting in the tissues underneath, where no one thinks to look sometimes. Then add to that the fact that blood spilled during a kill soaks fast into ground and leaf litter quite naturally. And that a predator killing with a bite to the throat, for instance, leaves very little external bleeding to begin with. With these sort of included, you have every ingredient you need for a perfectly ordinary killing to look to a frightened observer like the work of something that vampirically drinks blood. But watch what the newspapers did with that as well. The Charlotte News reached for the vampiric reading straight away. They went with drained of blood. The Wilmington Morning Star was more careful, but it still called the animal bloodthirsty. But that's more atmosphere rather than anatomy. These are two papers, the same, dealing with the same facts, but you can watch in real time how one of them picked the legend up and the other quietly gave it some distance. And that to me is the whole case in miniature. The difference between a story that is true and a story that merely feels true. Caught in the act in a contemporary record before a single modern retelling has laid finger on it. Now, could the killer have been rabid? It's one of the things I first thought about. It's a better idea than it first looks, and I don't want to wave it away, but a rabid animal would explain some things that are otherwise strange. Rabies produces exactly the kind of indiscriminate, fearless aggression we're seeing described. An animal attacking dogs it wouldn't normally avoid, for instance. Hypersalivation is also a hallmark of the disease, and there was that pool of saliva on the Vause porch. And rabies burns itself out, so in a short period of time, that might fit an outbreak that ended as abruptly as this one did. But I think it also hits a ceiling. Rabid animals generally don't feed on their kills, and at least one of these dogs was fed on. So it's something to think about, but it's again not completely out of the question. The furious phase of rabies also runs for days, not the 2 to 3 weeks this seemed to go on. And the later stages bring weakness and loss of coordination, so you wouldn't see that same level of aggression continually, which sits very badly indeed with an animal crushing skulls and evading organised hunts night after night. So rabies might explain one animal in one window, but I don't think it explains the whole event. Which brings me to what I think is actually going on here. And it's not a single answer. It's perhaps the recognition that we've been asking the wrong question. The instinct from 1954 right through to every retelling since is to assume there was one beast, one creature responsible for all of the attacks, sightings, and so forth. But look back at the evidence, and I don't think it holds together as one animal, because it splits cleanly into two streams that point in opposite directions. On one side, there's the kills, the crushed skulls, the torn away jaws, the dog-directed aggression. And this is the detail nobody knows what to do with. The tracks were repeatedly described as dog-like, canid. Now, held on its own, that print stops being an oddity and starts being a clue, because everything on the kill side of the ledger is consistent with a large feral dog. Or maybe a small pack of them, but I think that's less likely. The bite force, the willingness to attack other dogs, this all ties in with it potentially being a dog. And there's even a candidate. There's the local story of a German Shepherd hound mix that had gone feral in the swamp, a dog people called Big Boy. And I know a feral dog is the dull answer, but it fits very, very well, particularly with the physical evidence we have. On the other side, there's the sightings. That cat-like face, the long tail, at least in some descriptions, and that dark colour. The sense again and again of something feline and unusual. These do not describe a dog at all. So you have appearance evidence pointing at a cat and kill evidence pointing at something canid. And the honest thing to do is stop forcing them to be the same animal, I think. And here's where it gets a little sharper. And here's where the two exotic cat candidates also fall in place. Take the Jaguarundi first, because it's the one that fits the look almost perfectly. It's low-slung, long-tailed, it's dark-coloured, and it's cat-faced. It's exactly the impression the sightings give. And there's a lovely piece of genetics that makes it fit even better than people assume. The common instinct is to treat a dark cat as strange, but in a jaguarundi, dark is the normal form. The grey-brown coat is the widespread derived colour. And it's the reddish coat that people once assumed was the odd one that is actually the ancestral form. Now it's the rarer of the two. So a dark, long-tailed, cat-faced animal isn't an unusual jaguarundi. It's a completely typical one. But the jaguarundi has never been confirmed in North Carolina. Its official range is restricted to southern Texas, with a feral population in Florida. And modern camera trap work suggests it may now even be vanishing from Texas. The second, as I say, is size. A jaguarundi weighs maybe 8, 9, 10 pounds, and it could not crush a hound skull if its life depended on it, which it probably would if it was facing one. So the jaguarundi could look like what people saw, but it doesn't quite fit. And it could not possibly have done what was done to some of these dogs. The two streams just fail to meet. Then there's the mountain lion, which sits in the middle and is much more a likely candidate. It has the power the jaguarundi lacks, and of course it's cat-like. It would explain the sense of something bigger and wrong. Its problem is the colour, and that's really the only thing, because that Clarkton animal and several after it were described as black. And I agree that perhaps people could get it wrong. But a black cougar is a thing I've gone looking for many times on the back of many reports. And here's what lands. Melanism, the genetic condition that turns a cat's coat black, is real and well documented across the cat family. It turns up in 11 of 37 wildcat species that we know of. And it's arisen independently from at least 4 different separate mutations across the evolution of the cat family. So melanism itself is not exotic. But when researchers screened the puma for these mutations, they found nothing. And in the entire record, there's never been a single confirmed melanistic cougar, not a single one. The rare colour anomaly that does show up is the opposite, leucism, the pale white animals. Statistically, the potential may be there. The gene does exist, but if it was a black lion is a claim resting on an animal that no one anywhere has ever verified exists. And that's a real strike against your most powerful suspect. But I realise colours can look wrong in the dark, that sort of thing. I don't say it lightly because I wanted the black cougar or a dark cougar to be the answer for years. So where does the analysis leave us? I think it leaves us with a decoupling. The kills get the unglamorous answer that the evidence actually fits, which is that it was most likely a large feral dog. With the door open to one aberrant or a diseased animal in a different window. And the cat-faced thing that people saw stays genuinely and honestly unexplained. We can't force it into the sort of the dog level attacks, and we can't force it to become a black cougar that has never been confirmed to exist. I think we should expect and accept in these cases that sometimes things are left standing where the evidence leaves it. And that, for my money, is the honest shape of the Beast of Bladenboro. Not necessarily one monster, but 2 ordinary mysteries that the town, understandably, fused into a single, more extraordinary one. And that fusing, that's the real subject here. Because if you step back, this isn't only the story of what killed some dogs in a North Carolina winter. It's a story about how a monster gets made. And Bladenboro lets you watch it happen almost frame by frame. Look again at that film. On the 9th of January, at the height of the panic, the Mayor's Own Theatre screened The Big Cat, a movie about a mountain lion terrorising a rural community. And he had gone to great lengths to find that film and promote it. I don't think you have to imagine any conspiracy to see what that does. Put a big cat terror picture in front of a frightened town and you have handed every future witness a template, but you've also built the want and need to go and see that film. But every person who sees a shape in the dark now has a very specific idea of what they're looking at. We must remember that fear is suggestible, and the mayor, whether he meant to or not, had made that suggestion, whether in the build-up towards the film or by creating a fiasco that led to watching the film. The town was primed long before the film too. The catamount was already there in the culture, as we said. The screaming phantom cat of Southern memory. And when people needed a shape for their fear, they didn't have to invent one. They reached for the one that was basically already waiting. Then the newspapers took a scatter of separate killings across days and locations and did what newspapers do on a slow news day. They gave it a single subject. They formed it into a story, a single beast. Because a series of unrelated predator attacks is not a story. That's just Tuesday in the country. But the Beast of Bladenboro is a story. And presiding over all of it is a mayor who owned the movie theatre. A man who understood better than anyone in that town that a thrill is a product. Years later, Fussell said something about the whole affair that I think is the most honest sentence anyone connected to this story has ever said. He said that the Beast of Bladenboro was 10% real and 90% imagination. And I think he would know, because he was the one who built that 90%. But at the same time, let's not lose the 10, because here's the part that keeps this off the debunking pile and keeps it honest. The machine that made the beast never actually switched off. Decades later, the killings allegedly came back. In 2007, a fresh wave of dead animals and the name returned with them. The Beast of Bladenboro was seemingly back on the prowl. Except those deaths were scattered across different towns in different counties, tens of miles apart. It was the media and then the television production that needed a monster with a sequel that stitched them into a single returning creature. So we could see the gears of the same machine turning, running again and doing exactly what it did in 1954. So what was the Beast of Bladenboro? The most honest answer is that as a single creature, it never existed. It was simply assembled out of real dead animals and bad forensics. It was made from a phantom cat that was already in the culture, out of newspapers that knew a good name when they heard one, and out of a mayor who understood that a scared town is also an audience. Take all of that away and you're left with that 10%. And the 10% is still worth looking at, because something did kill those dogs, quite savagely. Something crushed those skulls, ripped those jaws off. And whatever people saw on those porches in the dark thing with the face exactly like a cat, only too big, was never caught, never confirmed, and never explained. And that's the part that keeps this story alive, not actually that legend. The legend is something I think, in retrospect and with a bit of examination, we can understand. We can see the seams in it. But it's the small, stubborn, unglamorous residue underneath that stays with us. The killings that fit no clean answer. The cat that doesn't fit any description of known animals. And the chief's own hounds out on that night on the 3rd of January, refusing to take the trail. Refusing to follow it. Even though they and their master knew the woods. It's almost like they knew what belonged there, and that whatever this was, they wanted no part of it. Thanks again, as always, for joining me for another look at a cryptid folklore. Please join me again soon, and as always, thank you so much for watching. If you do like these sort of folklore examinations, these stories from the cryptid past, please do like the video and subscribe. I'd love to have you join me again soon for another tale. As always, bye for now.